The unbreakable wall. The air inside the Harrison County Courthouse in Jackson, Mississippi was stifling, thick with the weight of history. The kind of history that didn't make it into textbooks, but lingered in the walls, in the way people walked, in the way whispers carried between attorneys. Everyone who stepped into courtroom 3B knew one thing: Judge Eleanor Whitmore was the law. And the law, in her hands, had never been fair. For 30 years, she sat on the bench, wearing the same expression of restrained disgust, when a defense attorney, especially a black defense attorney, dared challenge her rulings. She was the kind of judge who never raised her voice, never lost her temper, but wielded prejudice with the precision of a scalpel. No one had ever stood against her and won. Not once. Until now. "You're already on thin ice." Malcolm Graves walked into the courtroom, his polished black leather shoes tapping against the marble floor like a metronome counting down the seconds until battle. This wasn't his first time standing before Judge Whitmore, but today was different. Today, he wasn't just another defense attorney. Today, he was here to take her down. Whitmore didn't even bother to look up when he approached the defense table. She flipped through a file, adjusted her gold-rimmed glasses, and exhaled through her nose as if he had already wasted enough of her time. "Mr. Graves," she said, finally glancing up, "I don't have the patience for your theatrics today." Malcolm smirked. "Good morning to you too, Your Honor." She didn't acknowledge the greeting. "You're already on thin ice in my courtroom," she continued. "Don't test me. No reason, no explanation, just a warning." That was how she operated. She didn't just run her courtroom, she ruled it. And if you weren't on her side, you were against her. Malcolm just straightened his navy blue tie and took his seat. This wasn't his first war, and it damn sure wouldn't be his last. A stacked deck. The case before the court was the state of Mississippi v. Deshaun Carter, a young black man falsely accused of assaulting a police officer. The case was weak, laughably weak. There was no DNA evidence, no security footage. The only witness was a discredited officer with a history of falsifying reports. But that didn't matter, not in Judge Whitmore's courtroom. Here, the verdict had already been decided. Prosecutor Christopher Hawthorne, a blonde-haired, smug-faced good old boy fresh out of law school, was already flashing a cocky grin as he stood to address the jury. "The state is ready, Your Honor." Of course they were. They were always ready when the deck was stacked against men like Deshaun Carter. Malcolm leaned slightly toward his client. Deshaun sat stiff, hands clenched in his lap, eyes flicking around the courtroom like a man waiting for the walls to close in. He had been through this too many times. He knew what was coming. Malcolm patted his arm once, a silent reassurance. "We're ready too," he said, his voice firm. Whitmore arched an eyebrow, like she was surprised he had the nerve to say it. Then she smirked. "Let's get this over with." Rigging the game. The trial started. It wasn't a trial. It was a performance. And Judge Whitmore was the star. Every time Malcolm raised an objection, it was denied without hesitation. Every time Hawthorne fumbled, Whitmore guided him like a mentor helping a prize student. The jury noticed. The gallery noticed. But no one said anything, because no one ever did. But Malcolm was counting. Every bias ruling, every dismissed objection, every time Whitmore protected the prosecution. She was doing exactly what he needed her to do, proving, in real time, that she was corrupt. He let it go, for now. But the moment she crossed the line, he'd be ready. The breaking point. It came sooner than expected. Hawthorne stood, adjusting his expensive suit. The prosecution calls Officer Mark Reynolds to the stand. The jury barely reacted. The gallery murmured. Everyone knew who Reynolds was. A disgraced cop. A man caught lying under oath. Twice. A man who had falsified reports, assaulted civilians, and had 3 misconduct complaints sitting in internal affairs. Malcolm stood immediately. "Objection, Your Honor. Officer Reynolds has a documented history of perjury. His testimony is unreliable and should be inadmissible. Whitmore didn't even hesitate. Overruled. Malcolm narrowed his eyes. I'd like the court to acknowledge that the prosecution is relying on a witness with multiple allegations of falsifying police reports. Whitmore cut him off. I said overruled, Mr. Graves. Her voice was sharp, edged with something dangerously close to satisfaction. Malcolm took a slow breath. Just to be clear, Your Honor, he said, deliberately, you are refusing to acknowledge the credibility issues of this witness. A beat of silence. The gallery leaned in. Even some of the jury members looked at each other. Whitmore's eyes darkened. I said overruled. She was getting angry. Good. Malcolm folded his hands in front of him. I move for an immediate mistrial. Whitmore laughed. Not a full laugh. Just a quiet, knowing chuckle. Denied. That was her mistake. Because Malcolm wasn't here to win this case. He was here to end her reign. He didn't react. Didn't show his hand. Instead, he reached into his briefcase and pulled out a sealed folder, one he had spent the last 4 years preparing. The folder that contained everything. The bribes. The case manipulations. The evidence tampering. The witness coercion. And the names of the federal investigators waiting just outside the courtroom doors. Malcolm didn't open it. Not yet. Because first, he needed one last thing. One final nail in her coffin. And then, the doors swung open. 2 federal agents stepped in. The room went still. For the first time in 30 years, Judge Eleanor Whitmore wasn't the most powerful person in the room. Malcolm leaned back in his chair and smiled. He had waited for this moment. And now, it had finally arrived. The reckoning begins. The moment the doors of the courtroom swung open, a wave of tension rippled through the space, thick and suffocating. Every set of eyes turned toward the 2 men who had just stepped inside, dressed in crisp, dark suits, their presence an undeniable shift in the power dynamic. The lead agent, a broad-shouldered man with sharp features and an unreadable expression, strode forward with a sense of authority that even Judge Whitmore couldn't ignore. His partner, slightly shorter but just as imposing, flanked him, scanning the room with an air of quiet efficiency. Malcolm Graves remained seated, his fingers lightly drumming against the folder in front of him, the very one that contained years of damning evidence against the woman sitting on the bench. He had anticipated this moment for so long that now, as it unfolded before him, he found himself watching it with a mixture of satisfaction and carefully measured patience. This wasn't just about this case, about Deshaun Carter or the fabricated testimony of Officer Reynolds. This was about decades of unchecked power, about a system that had allowed Judge Eleanor Whitmore to wield her gavel like a weapon, cutting down those she deemed unworthy of justice. For a moment, Whitmore's reaction was exactly what Malcolm expected. She straightened in her chair, lifting her chin with the air of a woman who had faced down countless attorneys, prosecutors and defendants alike without ever having to answer for her actions. Her lips pressed into a thin line, her grip tightening on the polished wooden bench before her. But her voice, when she finally spoke, was as cold and controlled as ever. I don't know who you think you are, but I am in the middle of a trial, she said, her words measured yet laced with irritation. Whatever business you have will have to wait until these proceedings are concluded. The lead agent, who had not yet identified himself, reached into the pocket of his suit and pulled out a folded sheet of paper, his movements slow, deliberate, meant to send a clear message. Judge Eleanor Whitmore, he said, his voice calm but commanding, we have a federal warrant for your arrest. This cannot wait. For the first time in her decades-long career, Whitmore's composure cracked, only slightly, a flicker of uncertainty in her usually impassive gaze. But it was enough. The reaction did not go unnoticed by the jury, by the gallery, by the young prosecutor, Christopher Hawthorne, who had been so eager to impress her. The courtroom had been hers for years, a domain where she ruled unchallenged, where verdicts were predetermined and defenses dismissed with little more than a smirk and the tap of a gavel. But now, with 2 federal agents standing before her, the power she had wielded with such impunity was slipping through her fingers. Malcolm took in every detail, his gaze sharp, his posture relaxed. He had known Whitmore would try to maintain control of the situation, but there was no way out of this. The case against her had been built meticulously, with patience and precision, each piece of evidence stacking up until there was no possible way for her to escape accountability. She exhaled slowly, her eyes narrowing behind her gold-rimmed glasses. "On what charges?" she asked, her voice as steady as she could force it. The agent unfolded the warrant, his partner moving slightly closer to the bench. "You are being charged with obstruction of justice, bribery, abuse of judicial power, and multiple violations of civil rights under federal law." His words were met with a gasp from the gallery, a murmur of stunned whispers spreading through the courtroom like wildfire. Some had suspected her corruption, had spoken of it in hushed voices behind closed doors, but to see it laid bare in such an official capacity, it was a reckoning long overdue. Whitmore clenched her jaw, her fingers digging into the wood of the bench, but Malcolm saw it, the uncertainty creeping into her expression, the realization that for the first time, she was the one on trial. Even her once loyal prosecutor, Hawthorne, had paled considerably, his hands clenching the edge of his notes as if he had just realized he was standing on the losing side of history. Malcolm finally stood, the deliberate slowness of his movements drawing all attention to him. He adjusted his tie, his fingers brushing over the folder on the desk, before he turned fully toward the judge. "Your Honor," he said, his voice steady but with an unmistakable undertone of finality, "I believe you just denied my motion for a mistrial. But it seems that at this moment, this trial is no longer your primary concern." Whitmore's gaze snapped toward him, her expression darkening with something that almost resembled hatred, but Malcolm didn't falter. He met her glare head-on, unwavering, because he had waited too long for this moment, had worked too hard to expose the depths of her corruption. There had been a time when attorneys feared her, when defense lawyers knew walking into her courtroom meant an uphill battle against not just the prosecution, but against a judge who had already decided their client's fate. Not anymore. The lead agent stepped forward, extending the warrant toward her. "Judge Whitmore, I need you to stand." She remained seated, as if refusing to acknowledge the reality of the situation could somehow change it. "This is ridiculous," she hissed, her carefully constructed mask beginning to crumble at the edges. The second agent didn't hesitate. "If you refuse to comply, we will be forced to remove you." A sharp, tense silence filled the room. The jury, the gallery, even the court officers who had once carried out her orders without question now watched with a mix of fascination and disbelief. Finally, Whitmore moved. Slowly, stiffly, she pushed back her chair and stood, her posture rigid, her hands trembling only slightly at her sides. She looked at the agents, then at the paper they held, and finally, she turned her gaze toward Malcolm, her expression unreadable yet brimming with something dark, something bitter. "You think this changes anything?" she asked, her voice low, sharp. Malcolm simply offered her a knowing smile. "I think it changes everything." And then, with a swift, almost ceremonial click, the agents snapped the handcuffs around her wrists. The sound echoed through the silent courtroom. For the first time in 30 years, Eleanor Whitmore was not the one delivering a sentence. She was the one receiving it. The room erupted. The whispers turned to outright conversations, reporters scrambling to jot down every last detail, cameras flashing as they captured the once unshakable judge being led away in cuffs. The jurors, still seated, exchanged looks of stunned disbelief. Even Hawthorne, who had aligned himself so closely with Whitmore, looked as though the ground had been ripped out from under him. Malcolm exhaled, watching as she was escorted through the very doors she had so often dismissed others through. The weight of her power had been lifted from the courtroom, the suffocating presence of her authority shattered in an instant. But this wasn't the end. this was only the beginning. Because now, every case she had presided over, every wrongful conviction, every man and woman who had been sent away by her corrupt rulings would need to be re-examined. Deshaun Carter turned toward Malcolm, his voice low with disbelief. "So, does that mean my case is over?" Malcolm turned back to the bench, where another judge was already being called in to take over. His lips curled into a small, satisfied smile. "Not yet," he said, "but it's about to be." And with that, the second battle began, unraveling the system. The weight of what had just transpired inside Harrison County Courthouse hung thick in the air like a storm cloud that refused to dissipate. The doors through which Judge Eleanor Whitmore had been led out in handcuffs were still swinging slightly from the force of their closure, and yet the entire courtroom remained frozen in the aftershock. A judge who had ruled with an iron grip for over 30 years, who had manipulated the scales of justice in ways no one had dared to challenge, was now gone. And with her absence, a strange shift began to settle over the room. An unspoken realization that the untouchable had just been touched, the unbreakable had just been broken. But Malcolm Graves wasn't celebrating. Not yet. Because while Whitmore was no longer presiding over the courtroom, the damage he had inflicted was still very much present. Deshaun Carter, his client, still sat at the defense table, his wrists no longer in cuffs but his freedom still hanging in the balance. The case she had been overseeing was still technically in progress, and the young prosecutor Christopher Hawthorne was still standing near the prosecution's table, gripping the edge of his notes as if they were the last thing tethering him to some semblance of control. The murmurs in the gallery had reached a fever pitch, with reporters already scrambling to make phone calls, typing furiously on their laptops, and snapping pictures of the now empty judge's bench. Jurors, who had likely walked into this trial assuming it would be a routine criminal proceeding, now looked shaken, exchanging glances that communicated their unspoken uncertainty. Malcolm allowed a moment for the room to absorb the gravity of the situation before he turned, his gaze landing firmly on Judge Harold Mendez, the senior judge who had been hastily assigned to step in following Whitmore's arrest. Judge Mendez was a stark contrast to Whitmore in every conceivable way. A black man in his late 60s, with a no-nonsense demeanor, and a career built on fairness rather than fear, he had spent years attempting to combat the judicial corruption that had plagued Mississippi's legal system. Unlike Whitmore, Mendez had earned his place through integrity, not intimidation. He adjusted his glasses and cleared his throat before speaking, his voice carrying a gravelly authority that immediately commanded attention. "As you are all aware, the circumstances in this courtroom have taken an unprecedented turn. However, the trial before us is still an active case, and it is my duty to ensure that justice is properly served." His gaze flicked toward Malcolm, then to the prosecution. Mr. Graves, Mr. Hawthorne, approached the bench. Malcolm moved with deliberate composure, his polished shoes clicking against the marble floor as he made his way forward. Hawthorne hesitated for half a second, his youthful arrogance visibly shaken by the absence of the mentor he had relied upon. But he followed nonetheless, the papers in his hand trembling slightly. When both men stood before him, Judge Mendez laced his fingers together, his eyes sharp as they assessed the situation. "Mr. Graves, you filed a motion for a mistrial prior to Judge Whitmore's removal. Do you wish to renew that motion?" Malcolm didn't hesitate. "Yes, Your Honor. The basis of my motion remains unchanged." Judge Whitmore demonstrated blatant judicial bias throughout these proceedings. Her arrest only further proves what we already knew. This trial was tainted from the start. He let his words settle, making sure they carried the weight they deserved. To allow this trial to continue would be to legitimize the actions of a corrupt judge, and that would be a miscarriage of justice. Hawthorne, who up until now had been staring at his notes as if searching for an argument that simply wasn't there, finally spoke. "Your Honor, while I acknowledge the abrupt circumstances surrounding Judge Whitmore's departure, I don't believe that invalidates the entire trial." His voice lacked the confidence it had held earlier in the day, but he pressed forward anyway. The prosecution still believes the evidence against Mr. Carter is sufficient to warrant a conviction. Malcolm let out a quiet exhale through his nose. This was what Hawthorne didn't understand. This wasn't just about the case anymore. This was about everything Whitmore had done, everything she had touched, everything she had manipulated. Even now, standing in a courtroom where the very foundation of the judicial system had just been shaken, Hawthorne still thought he could win. Judge Mendez studied both attorneys carefully before leaning back slightly in his chair. His fingers tapped against the desk, a rhythmic sound filling the brief silence before he finally spoke again. I have reviewed the case file in the short time I've been here, and it is clear to me that Judge Whitmore's conduct throughout this trial was, at the very least, questionable. He shifted his gaze toward the jury, then back at Malcolm. However, in the interest of due process, I want to hear, on record, the specific instances of misconduct you are alleging before I make my ruling. Malcolm was ready. He reached into his briefcase and pulled out a separate folder, one that contained detailed notes of every ruling, every overruled objection, every prejudiced remark Whitmore had made throughout the course of the trial. He opened the folder with practiced precision and began listing each violation methodically, his voice unwavering. First, Your Honor, Judge Whitmore repeatedly overruled valid defense objections while allowing the prosecution to introduce inadmissible evidence. He turned a page. Second, she actively coached the prosecution, stepping in to assist Mr. Hawthorne when he struggled with procedural errors. Another page. Third, she ignored a clear Brady violation. The prosecution failed to disclose evidence favorable to the defense, and rather than enforce the law, she dismissed it outright. The tension in the room grew with every word. He flipped another page. Fourth, she preemptively denied multiple defense motions before hearing any arguments, including a request for the exclusion of unreliable testimony. He paused for effect, his gaze locking onto Mendez. Your Honor, this trial was never meant to be fair. Judge Whitmore ensured that before we even began. Mendez exhaled slowly, his expression unreadable. He glanced toward Hawthorne, who had stopped flipping through his own notes entirely, his posture rigid with the understanding that he had no real argument against the truth. The judge nodded once. Very well. After considering the evidence, I am granting the defense's motion for a mistrial. A collective exhale filled the courtroom. Malcolm didn't move, didn't let any outward emotion slip, but inside there was a sharp, triumphant satisfaction. This wasn't just about Deshawn's case. This was about tearing down a system that had enabled corruption for too long. Judge Mendez turned toward Deshawn, who sat still, processing the words that had just been spoken. Mr. Carter, the charges against you are dismissed, and you are free to go. For a moment, Deshawn didn't move, as if waiting for someone to tell him it was a mistake. Then, slowly, he exhaled, a breath he had been holding since the moment he was arrested. The courtroom officer moved to remove his cuffs, and as the metal snapped open, Deshawn rubbed his wrists before turning to Malcolm, his expression unreadable. I don't even know what to say, man, he said, his voice low, raw with disbelief. Malcolm simply clasped a hand on his shoulder. You don't have to say anything. Because this wasn't over. Not yet. Whitmore's fall was just the first domino. There were dozens of cases she had presided over, hundreds of lives affected. And Malcolm Graves wasn't going to stop until every single one of them had their day in court. Digging up the past, Malcolm Graves stepped out of Harrison County Courthouse, inhaling the humid Mississippi air, heavy with the scent of approaching rain. The storm outside mirrored the storm that had just erupted inside. Judge Eleanor Whitmore was gone, her courtroom dismantled, her rulings under scrutiny. But Malcolm wasn't foolish enough to believe the battle was over. A single victory, even one as monumental as Whitmore's downfall, didn't mean the system had changed. It didn't mean the people she had sentenced, the men and women she had railroaded, would automatically receive justice. It only meant the door had been cracked open, just wide enough for Malcolm to force his way through. Beside him, Deshaun Carter stood in stunned silence, still adjusting to the reality of his newfound freedom. The young man had spent the last 18 months in county lockup awaiting trial for a crime he didn't commit, watching his life unravel as the system tried to swallow him whole. Even now, he looked hesitant, his hands flexing at his sides, as if expecting someone to drag him back inside and slap the cuffs on again. "You good?" Malcolm asked, his voice level but filled with unspoken understanding. Deshaun turned, blinking as though waking from a dream. "I don't know, man. It don't feel real yet." It never did, not at first. Malcolm had seen this look before, the look of a man who had been caged for so long that even when the door was flung open, he didn't trust it. Freedom, after being so viciously denied, felt like a trick, a cruel joke waiting to snap shut. "You're free," Malcolm assured him. "No strings attached." Deshaun let out a slow breath and nodded, but his eyes were still shadowed with something deeper. "What about the others?" The words settled between them like a weight, because Deshaun wasn't the only one. He was just one of many. Whitmore had sat on that bench for 3 decades, passing judgment on thousands of people, most of whom never stood a chance from the moment they walked into her courtroom. The question wasn't whether she had wrongfully convicted people, it was how many. Malcolm already knew what he had to do next. It was time to dig up the past. A system built on corruption. The next morning, Malcolm walked into his law office, a small but efficient space tucked into a downtown Jackson high-rise, the smell of fresh coffee mingling with the scent of legal briefs stacked high on his desk. His assistant, Lisa Turner, a sharp-witted woman who had been by his side for the past 5 years, was already waiting for him, 2 cups of coffee in hand and an expression that said she knew he wasn't done yet. "Tell me we're celebrating and not starting another war," she said, handing him a cup. Malcolm took it, offering a dry smirk. "We won a battle, Lisa, not the war." She sighed, but there was no real frustration behind it. "I figured. You've been up all night, haven't you?" He didn't answer, but the dark circles beneath his eyes spoke for him. Lisa shook her head. "What's next?" Malcolm set his coffee down and opened a thick file labeled Whitmore, Case Review. It was a list of names, cases that had passed through Whitmore's courtroom over the years. Not all of them were wrongful convictions, but too many bore the same hallmarks of judicial bias: questionable rulings, suppressed evidence, unusually harsh sentences for minor offenses. "These," Malcolm said, tapping the pages, "are the people who were railroaded by Whitmore's court. Some of them are still in prison, others out on parole. Some probably didn't make it out at all. We need to start reviewing these cases and getting their sentences overturned." Lisa skimmed through the files, her brows knitting together. "This is hundreds of cases." Malcolm nodded. "And these are just the ones I could access so far. The deeper we go, the more we'll find." Lisa exhaled slowly, rubbing her temples. "You know the system isn't just going to let this happen, right? Whitmore might be gone, but the people who backed her, the ones who let this slide for years, they're still here." She wasn't wrong. Judges don't operate in isolation. Whitmore's corruption hadn't existed in a vacuum. It had been tolerated, even encouraged, by those who benefited from it. Prosecutors, police officers, state officials. They all played a part in keeping the machine running. And now that Malcolm had thrown a wrench into its gears, they weren't going to let it grind to a halt without a fight. "That's why we don't just go through the cases," Malcolm said. "We go after the people who let this happen. Every lawyer, every officer, every official who knew what she was doing and stayed silent." He met Lisa's gaze. "We don't just fix the damage. We burn the whole damn system down and build something better." Lisa let out a slow whistle, shaking her head with something between exhaustion and admiration. "You really don't know when to quit, do you?" Malcolm smirked. "Never." She sighed but picked up her own coffee, flipping open the file. "All right then, let's get to work." Enemies in high places. By noon, Malcolm had already received his first warning. The email came through an anonymous account, the subject line simple but chilling. Drop it. The body of the email was even shorter. You won the case. Don't push your luck. Leave the past buried. Malcolm stared at the message for a long moment before leaning back in his chair, expression unreadable. He had expected pushback. He just hadn't expected it so soon. He forwarded the email to Lisa. A second later, she poked her head into his office, her face grim. "Well, that didn't take long," she muttered. "They're scared," Malcolm said, closing his laptop. "Which means we're on the right track." Lisa folded her arms. "Or it means you've pissed off the kind of people who don't mind making problems disappear." Malcolm wasn't naive. The people behind Whitmore's reign of injustice weren't just everyday bureaucrats. They were the kind of men who thrived in the shadows, who made sure the rules only applied to those beneath them. Taking down Whitmore had been a victory, but it had also painted a target on his back. Lisa tilted her head, studying him. "So, what's the play?" Malcolm smirked. "We keep pushing." Lisa rolled her eyes. "Of course we do." Malcolm reached for the next file on his desk, flipping it open to reveal another name. Another man still rotting in prison because of a rigged trial under Whitmore's watch. One case was overturned. But now, the floodgates were about to open. The battle lines are drawn. The tension in Malcolm Graves' office was suffocating. The anonymous email, still sitting in his inbox, was a stark reminder that Whitmore's corruption didn't exist in isolation. The system that had allowed her to operate unchecked for 3 decades was still very much alive. And now it was staring right back at him, warning him to stop before he dug too deep. Lisa Turner stood across from his desk, arms crossed, her expression a mix of concern and determination. "You think it's just a warning, or are we talking about something worse?" she asked, tapping her nails against the file in her hand. Malcolm exhaled, rolling his shoulders to release the tension building in them. "People like this don't make idle threats," he said, his voice even but laced with an undertone of steel. "They're letting us know they're watching, which means we're getting close to something they don't want us to find." Lisa clicked her tongue, flipping through the list of cases they had begun reviewing. "I hate to break it to them, but there's a hell of a lot to find." She gestured to the towering stack of files on his desk. Whitmore didn't do this alone. These cases weren't just biased. They were outright rigged. False evidence, forced confessions, jury tampering. This wasn't just one judge going rogue. This was an operation. Malcolm nodded. That was what had been gnawing at him since Whitmore's arrest. It wasn't just the sheer number of wrongful convictions. It was the deliberate orchestration of injustice. Someone wanted these people convicted. Someone had profited off their suffering. And that meant Whitmore wasn't the only one who needed to be brought down. "We need to figure out who was backing her," Malcolm said, leaning forward. "Start with the prosecutors she favored, the ones whose cases she always ruled in favor of. Then pull up the officers tied to those cases, the ones whose testimonies she never questioned." Lisa arched a brow. "So, in other words, we're about to piss off every powerful man in this city." Malcolm smirked. "Pretty much." Lisa sighed, shaking her head but already pulling out her laptop. "All right, let's see which rats we're feeding at the trough." The web of corruption. It didn't take long to start connecting the dots. Lisa's research uncovered a disturbing pattern. The same prosecutors, the same officers, the same courtroom. Over and over again. One name in particular stood out: Jonathan Mercer. Mercer had been a lead prosecutor in Harrison County for over 15 years, a man known for his aggressive tactics and near-perfect conviction rate. He had built his career on winning cases, on cleaning up the streets, a phrase that, when translated, meant burying black and brown men in the prison system, guilty or not. And Whitmore had been his most trusted judge. Malcolm tapped his pen against Mercer's file, his jaw tightening. This is the guy. He funneled cases to Whitmore because he knew she'd rule in his favor. She wasn't just biased. She was complicit. Lisa frowned, scrolling through old news reports. He's got deep connections, political backing, media influence, friends in law enforcement. If we go after him, we need more than circumstantial evidence. Malcolm already knew that. Taking down Whitmore had been one thing. She was the face of corruption. But Mercer, he was the architect. And architects don't fall easily. He needed proof, solid, irrefutable proof that Mercer had knowingly prosecuted innocent people, that he had worked with Whitmore to rig trials. That's when Lisa found it. A case from 10 years ago. A murder conviction that had been built entirely on false testimony from a jailhouse informant, an informant who later recanted his statement, claiming he had been coerced by Mercer himself. Malcolm's stomach turned as he read through the transcripts. Mercer had argued the case before Whitmore, and as expected, she had dismissed any challenge from the defense. The defendant, Terrence Cole, had been sentenced to life without parole based on fabricated evidence, and he was still in prison. Malcolm closed the file, his mind already racing ahead. This wasn't just about exposing corruption anymore. This was about getting an innocent man out of prison. "We have what we need," he said, standing abruptly. "We're taking this to the state bar." Lisa hesitated. "And if they ignore it?" Malcolm's expression hardened. "Then we take it to the court of public opinion." The backlash begins. Malcolm expected pushback, but he wasn't prepared for how quickly it came. The moment he filed the complaint against Mercer with the Mississippi State Bar, a storm erupted. Within 24 hours, his office was flooded with calls, some from journalists, some from anonymous numbers, some from people threatening him outright. Lisa walked in, holding up her phone. "You need to see this." She played a news segment from a local station, where a well-dressed anchor was reporting on the dangerous accusations Malcolm had made against one of the most respected prosecutors in the state. The narrative was already being shaped. Malcolm wasn't a whistleblower. He was a radical trying to undermine law and order. Mercer himself appeared on screen, standing behind a podium at a press conference. His voice was calm, measured, but Malcolm could hear the calculated malice beneath it. "These accusations are baseless and politically motivated," Mercer said smoothly. "I have spent my career seeking justice for victims, and I will not allow my reputation to be tarnished by those who have an agenda against law enforcement and the judicial system." Lisa clicked off the screen, shaking her head. "They're already spinning this. They're making you the villain." Malcolm leaned back in his chair, his lips pressing into a thin line. He had known Mercer would fight back, but what truly angered him was the ease with which the system protected its own. "Let them," Malcolm said coldly, "because when I'm done, no amount of spin is going to save him." A dangerous game. The next attack wasn't just on Malcolm's reputation. It was physical. 3 nights after filing the complaint, Malcolm left his office late, walking toward his car in the dimly lit parking lot. He had just unlocked the door when he heard footsteps behind him. Too fast, too purposeful. Instinct kicked in. He spun just as the first blow came, a heavy fist aimed at his ribs. He dodged, but the second man was already moving, slamming him against the car. A surge of pain shot through his side, but he didn't go down. The 2 attackers, ***, both wearing hooded sweatshirts, both fast, both trained. ***, didn't say a word. This wasn't a mugging. This was a warning. Malcolm fought back hard, landing a solid punch to one man's jaw before the other grabbed him from behind, shoving him to the pavement. A boot connected with his ribs, knocking the breath from his lungs. Then, just as suddenly as it started, it was over. The 2 men stepped back, one of them spitting on the ground beside him. "Drop the case," one muttered, his voice rough, his message clear. Then they were gone, disappearing into the night. Malcolm lay there for a moment, tasting blood in his mouth, his body aching. Then, slowly, he pushed himself up, his hands shaking, but not from fear. From rage. They thought this would scare him off. They had no idea who they were dealing with. No more deals, No more silence. Malcolm Graves sat in his office, his ribs still aching from the ambush in the parking lot. A faint bruise was forming along his jaw, and every deep breath sent a sharp stab through his side. But he ignored the pain. Pain was temporary. Justice was permanent. The men who had jumped him thought they could silence him, intimidate him into backing down. But they had only managed to confirm what he already knew. Jonathan Mercer and his people were scared. They were desperate to keep the truth buried, because they understood what Malcolm was now in possession of. Proof. The State Bar couldn't ignore the files he had submitted, not without exposing themselves as part of the problem. The media was divided, with some outlets dismissing him as a troublemaker and others finally waking up to the scope of the corruption. But the most important battle was still ahead. He had spent the past few days gathering more evidence, compiling every questionable case tied to Whitmore and Mercer, cross-referencing old court records, and speaking with whistleblowers, officers, clerks, even a former assistant prosecutor who had quietly resigned years ago after realizing what was going on. And now, it was time to take the fight where it mattered most. Court. Lisa stood in the doorway, arms crossed, her expression sharp. "You ready for this?" she asked, tilting her head toward the stack of legal briefs piled high on his desk. Malcolm gave a grim smile. "I've never been more ready." The courtroom battle begins. The courtroom was packed. Journalists, activists, defense attorneys, former defendants, and even a few law students filled every available seat. The air crackled with tension. At the front, Malcolm stood next to his newest client, Terrence Cole, the man sentenced to life in prison, based on fabricated evidence and perjured testimony. Cole, now 46, had spent the last 10 years behind bars, robbed of his freedom by a system that had never cared about the truth. And across the room, Jonathan Mercer himself. The once celebrated prosecutor stood rigid, his expression unreadable, dressed in an expensive suit, his legal team flanking him like a shield. His jaw was clenched, but Malcolm could see it, the cracks in the foundation. Mercer had built his career on untouchability, but today he wasn't untouchable anymore. Judge Mendez presided over the hearing. His presence alone was significant. Unlike Whitmore, he had a reputation for fairness, for holding everyone, regardless of race or status, accountable. He adjusted his glasses and cleared his throat before addressing the courtroom. This hearing has been called to determine whether the conviction of Terrence Cole was based on false evidence and prosecutorial misconduct. Mr. Graves, you may proceed. Malcolm nodded, stepping forward. He turned to face the courtroom, making sure to meet the jury's eyes, the reporters' pens, the cameras recording every second. Your Honor, the prosecution of Terrence Cole was not just a mistake. It was a crime. He let the words settle before continuing. The key witness, a jailhouse informant named Ramon Ellis, has recanted his testimony, admitting that he was coerced into lying by none other than Jonathan Mercer. The room stirred, whispers, gasps. Malcolm lifted a document. This is a sworn affidavit from Ellis, detailing how he was threatened and promised a reduced sentence if he testified against Mr. Cole. At the time, Ellis was facing 25 years for armed robbery. The prosecution, Mercer himself, cut him a deal. He turned to the judge. Your Honor, Mercer knowingly submitted false testimony, and Judge Whitmore, who, as we now know, had a history of judicial bias, refused to allow the defense to challenge it. Judge Mendez looked toward Mercer. Mr. Mercer, do you have a response? Mercer stood, his expression tight but composed. Your Honor, the prosecution maintains that the case against Mr. Cole was handled according to legal procedures at the time. Malcolm scoffed loudly. Legal procedures. Mr. Cole was sentenced to life based on a lie. You call that justice? Mercer ignored him. There is no evidence that I personally coerced Ellis. Malcolm cut him off. Really? Because we have a recording. The entire room went silent. Malcolm reached into his briefcase and pulled out a USB drive, handing it to the court clerk. "This is an audio recording from Ellis' former cellmate who overheard the deal being made. It's dated, time-stamped, and independently verified." The recording played. Mercer's voice was unmistakable. "Give me a name, and I'll make sure your time gets cut in half. Say whatever you need to. The judge will take my word for it." The reaction was immediate. Reporters scrambled. Jurors stiffened. The gallery erupted in murmurs. Mercer's face drained of color. Judge Mendez didn't hesitate. Silence in the courtroom. He turned to Mercer, his expression unreadable but firm. "Mr. Mercer, this court takes prosecutorial misconduct very seriously. You will answer for these allegations." Mercer, now visibly rattled, shifted uncomfortably. "Your Honor, this is taken out of context." Malcolm pounced. "Out of context? You were caught on tape bribing a witness to lie." Mendez turned toward Cole, who had remained silent throughout the chaos, his hands gripping the table so tightly his knuckles were white. The judge's voice softened slightly. "Mr. Cole, I will be overturning your conviction immediately. You are free to go." A collective gasp filled the room, followed by cheers from the gallery. Cole stared, wide-eyed, his lips parting as if he wanted to say something, but no words came. The weight of 10 stolen years pressed down on him. Malcolm reached over, squeezing his shoulder. "You're free, Terrence." And just like that, a wrongfully convicted man walked out of court as a free man. But Mercer, his battle had only just begun. The final blow. Hours later, Mercer was arrested. The recording had been damning, but it was only the beginning. More witnesses came forward. Former colleagues, ex-clients, even police officers who had worked with him. The house of cards he had built over the years was collapsing. Lisa stormed into Malcolm's office, grinning. "You watching this?" She pointed to the screen, where a live news feed showed Mercer being led out of his office in handcuffs, flanked by federal agents. Malcolm leaned back, exhaling slowly. "They finally got him." Lisa chuckled. "And I'm guessing this won't be the last one." Malcolm's smirk was sharp, not by a long shot. Whitmore had been step one. Mercer was step two. But there were more names, more corrupt officials, more broken cases, more people still locked away. And Malcolm wasn't stopping until they all fell. Because this was just the beginning.